Greek New Testament sentence diagramming. This is part 4 of our how-to series. We'll start as always with a little review. I won't belabor these review slides, so you might want to be ready on your pause button in case you need to stop and look at some of these slides for more time than I allot for them. First, we ask what a sentence diagram is. It's a grammatical map of the sentence, and some of the key components are baselines and shelves for modifiers, branches to show coordinate series, stilts or standards to show elements that are too complex to fit into their simple slot. I should have mentioned for the baselines that these display the core, sometimes called kernel elements, of subject, verb, and complement for the clause that they host. The building blocks of grammar are those kernel elements that I just mentioned, and then there are modifiers, words or phrases that supply more information about some other word or phrase, and there are series. I've shown 2 series here, the blind and the lame, died and rose. These are each pairs of items in a series, but a series can theoretically have any number of items at all. I want to hit these who or what questions again because they're so important they can hardly be overemphasized. Once you have identified the verb and translated it in its proper voice, to find the subject of the verb, you just ask who or what before that verb expression. To find the complement, you ask who or whom, if you want to be picky about the English grammar, whom or what after the verb. And the sentence material that answers these questions serves in each case as the subject or the complement. Then we considered building blocks of grammar with the illustration of a jigsaw puzzle. Taking the sentence, the Son of Man will conquer his enemies on the last day, we built the kernel. Will conquer is the verb. Who or what will conquer? The Son will conquer. The Son will conquer whom or what? He'll conquer enemies. So there's our kernel. The Son will conquer enemies. And then we have a number of modifiers. Of man tells us more about the Son. On the day, as a whole prepositional phrase, tells us more about will conquer. And within that prepositional phrase, the day answers a what question, a who or what question after the preposition on. So it's functioning as the object of that preposition, on the day. And then the word day has a modifier, last. And finally, the word enemies has a modifier, the possessive his. Then at the bottom of the screen, you see that diagram converted to Reed-Kellogg form, using the ordinary symbols in the Reed-Kellogg conventions. And we went on to try it in Greek instead of in English. And we took a simple sentence from 1 John 1:7, the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin. We found the verb first, katharidze, cleanses. Who or what cleanses? The blood of Jesus cleanses. The blood of Jesus cleanses whom or what? It cleanses us. So we've got the kernel, and then the modifiers worked in here as is appropriate. Then I gave you a chance to try it in Greek. I gave you a simple sentence and paused while you diagrammed it. You have an anointing from the Holy One. And 2 ways this could be done. A little difficult to decide whether from the Holy One is adverbial modifying ekate, or whether it actually modifies chrisma more as an adjective. Then we went on to one that was a little tougher. You have to admit that last sentence was quite simple. His Son, the only begotten, God sent into the world. And here the word order of the Greek is considerably different than what we would do in English. The direct object comes first. You see ton huion in the accusative case, so it's not the subject of the clause. And here are 2 ways that this could be diagrammed. The difference between them being whether the modifiers for huion are stacked vertically or whether they're spaced out horizontally. In both cases, both of these modifiers modify the Son, and it's just a difference of where you need to economize on space. If you need to economize on horizontal space, then you stack your modifiers vertically. If you need to economize on vertical space, then you arrange your modifiers side by side, as we see here. So any number of modifiers can be placed along the descending line beneath the head word. Here we just have 2. The thing we don't want to do is take monogene as modifying autou. Students sometimes get in the habit of just kind of chunking out the clause piece by piece, and every new piece gets attached to what immediately preceded it. If you did it that way, you'd have ton huion, and then attached to that would be autou. So far, so good. But then if you take ton monogene and attach it to autou, that is an out-and-out error, because ton monogene does not agree in gender, number, and case with autou. It agrees in gender, number, and case with huion. So it needs to be diagrammed as modifying huion, not as modifying autou. So that would be a big no-no. Now, on to our new material for part 4. We'll add some new functions and their symbols. First, the indirect object. We could think of this almost as a kernel element because it is an object. It's part of the verb's complement. Here's a simple example, Matthew 2:11. They presented to him gifts. So if we build our basic grammatical kernel here, the verb is presented. Who or what presented? There's an understood subject, they. They presented who or what. To him does not answer that question. It's the next word after the verb, but it's not the answer to the who or what question. The answer to the who or what question is the word gifts. They presented gifts. And to him is the dative case, indirect object, and we need to learn how to diagram that. So here's one way we would do it as we build the baseline and get our subject, verb, and object arranged. We can then put the indirect object beneath the verb. It modifies the verb, so we can put it beneath the verb on a shelf. You notice there's a little difference between the indirect object shelf and the simple modifier shelf, and that's this little leftward pointing stub. This is just a diagramming convention. It frankly isn't very important to me personally. As far as I'm concerned, you could treat auto just as a simple modifier. But since it's conventional, I'll go ahead and use it here with that little leftward pointing stub. The other way you can do this is to actually put that indirect object right on the baseline. And that little stub kind of joins up to the object as part of the baseline. And you notice the angle of the line ascending from the baseline. That gives us the idea that the action of the verb is performed upon the object kind of in the direction of the indirect object. So they gave gifts to him. There's a little directional indication with that slanting line as it is. One of the issues with putting the indirect object right on the baseline is that sometimes there's another sentence element that really needs to come immediately after the direct object. And you would have some interference if you had two elements that both needed to follow directly after the direct object. So one way to resolve that is to go ahead and be willing to diagram the indirect object as a modifier to the verb rather than as a kernel element on the baseline. My own practice personally is to prefer the modifying construction unless I just am so limited on space that I really need to economize by doing it right on the baseline. Now, as we're working with indirect objects, we want to take a little time and make sure that we don't confuse the indirect object with a couple of other grammatical constructions. There is such a thing as a dative case direct object. Some verbs take their object in the dative case. So in Matthew 2:11, they worshiped him. They didn't worship something to him. The word him answers the who or what question after the verb. They worshiped who or what? They worshiped him. That's the direct object. An indirect object would mean that they worshiped something else to him, and that's not what the sentence is saying at all. So be aware that there is such a thing as a dative case direct object. Not every dative you see has to be an indirect object. So how would this look in a diagram? You probably are already envisioning it correctly. They worshiped him. The dative just goes right in the direct object slot. Another common construction that can easily be confused with the indirect object is the dative of personal interest. You may or may not have heard of this construction, but this is with intransitive verbs. It's a dative that sort of feels like an indirect object. You would translate it with to or maybe for, just like you would an indirect object, but it cannot be an object because the verb isn't transitive. Let me give you an example, and then we'll talk about transitive and intransitive verbs. So again in Matthew 2, verse 13, an angel appears to Joseph. So we have a dative case, to Yosef. The word Yosef is indeclinable. You don't see any case ending on it, but you see the dative case article in front of it. So we know that Yosef is in the dative case, and we translate it with the word to. It feels very much like an indirect object. But appears is not the kind of word that can take objects. Certain verbs have the kind of action that can be performed upon objects. Those are called transitive verbs. The intransitive verbs are more self-contained. You don't perform them upon an object, you just do them. So an angel doesn't appear something. It wouldn't even be sensible to ask the who or what question after this verb. The angel appears who or what? Well, nobody appears anything. You just appear as a self-contained action. That's an intransitive verb. There are some verbs that will take complements, and so there is a sentence item to answer the who or what question, but still the nature of the verb is not an action verb. The linking verbs would be examples of this. Jesus is God. Jesus is who or what? He is God. But is not an action that you can perform upon an object. So when the verb is intransitive, there are no objects to receive its action. That means there can be no indirect object. If you can't conceptually have a direct object, then you would not be able to have an indirect object either. So we would not want to diagram to Yosef in verse 13 of Matthew 2 as an indirect object. This is what's called the dative of personal interest. The verb is intransitive, And the dative case is typically given some advantage or disadvantage as a result of the action of the verb. Here, clearly, it would be a matter of a positive interest, the advantage idea, the angel appearing to Joseph's advantage. So how would this be diagrammed? If it's not an indirect object, how would we diagram to Yosef? Well, it's just a simple modifier for the verb. So we would use an ordinary modifier shelf for the dative of personal interest. Another sentence function we'll consider in this video is the appositive function. I have used the word nominal in parentheses. By nominal, I mean this is a noun type function. So the appositive will be a noun or some other part of speech made to function as a noun within that context. So this is a nominal function, a noun type function, and the function is one of simple renaming. So let's see an example, again in Matthew 2, verse 11. They saw the child with Mary, and after Mary is immediately attached the word tes metras, Mary, the mother of him. And mother is simply renaming Mary. You notice that the appositive is in the same case as the word it renames. It carries the same basic sentence function as its head word that it renames, so it will be in the same case. But that function is already supplied by the head word. The appositive is just a renamer expanding the head word with further identifying information of some sort. So how would we diagram an appositive? Maybe you can already envision it. Here's the basic sentence without the appositive. They saw the child with Mary. The place to attach the word mother is just to the right of Mary with an equal sign joining the two. So you notice that the line under Mary breaks. It doesn't continue on over. There's a break in the line to separate metras as a separate sentence element. And the connection that's made is made by the equal sign that says that Mary is the same person as the mother. And then out 2, of course, is the modifier for metras. What happens when a sentence starts with a conjunction? A conjunction joins its clause to what precedes, but when a sentence starts with a conjunction, you can't join it to the preceding sentence because you have to start a brand new sentence diagram. So how do we diagram the first conjunction that opens many, if not most, sentences in the Greek New Testament? Well, let's take an example, again, from Matthew 2, where we've been working. A little fuller expression of the sentence we just worked with says, and having come into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And that sentence starts with the conjunction kai. Well, here's the sentence diagrammed out. I've added the participle at the bottom here as adverbial to the verb they saw, having come into the house. Where would we put that initial kai that opens this sentence? Well, it'd be nice to put it kind of in the upper left-hand corner somewhere, wouldn't it, as the first element in the sentence? So let's do this. We'll put it on a little shelf of its own, but it doesn't hang under anything. Instead, there's a dotted line connecting that conjunction down to the baseline. If that were a solid line instead of a dotted line, it would look almost as though that baseline modifies the word kai. The baseline would look like a modifier shelf to the word kai. So to avoid that appearance, we just make that a dotted line, and the kai stands there in the upper left to open that sentence. Let's look at another sentence. This time we'll go to the book of Galatians. For you were called to freedom, brothers, and the word gar is the opening conjunction. So here's our basic clause, you were called to freedom, and here's our introductory conjunction gar. And you may notice that it seems to stand awfully high above that baseline. Why did I make that dotted vertical line so long? Well, you'll see that in a moment. The thing to notice for now is here's another example with a different kind of conjunction. It doesn't have to be a coordinating conjunction. Gar is more of a subordinating conjunction, introducing a reason or a cause. Any kind of conjunction that begins a new sentence would be diagrammed as I'm showing here in blue. One other sentence element that we'll discuss in this video is the interjection or direct address, a vocative case idea, and you'll see how that works in a moment. The verse we just looked at in Galatians 5 has a direct address element at the end of the clause. For you were called to liberty, brothers. So Paul is directly addressing his readers as brethren. You could put that word brothers right at the beginning of the sentence. For brothers, you were called to liberty. More often, the vocative will be near the beginning of the sentence, but in this particular instance, it comes at the end. Now, we would like to put the interjection in the upper left-hand corner, similarly to what we have done with the introductory conjunction. But how can we do that if we've already put an introductory conjunction in the upper left? And I've mentioned that most sentences in Greek seem to start, many if not most, seem to start with an introductory conjunction. How could we also put the word brothers there? We can't put them both in the same spot. Well, here's our conjunction standing high enough above the baseline that now we have room to put the word brother halfway down. So this is why I put the word gar up so high on that previous slide, to allow room for adelphoi as the direct address. Now you notice the difference. Gar is on a shelf that has the dotted line descending from somewhere in the middle of its length. Adelphoi has the dotted line descending from its left edge. And the symbolism here is supposed to be something like this. The gar stands almost in place of a previous sentence that our new sentence connects back to as part of the main line of grammatical development. But the word adelphoi is kind of an insertion. It's not a major piece of grammatical development. It's just a little insertion. And so it kind of stands off to the side of that dotted line that represents the main line of the flow of thought, and that helps to distinguish it as an inserted idea rather than as a conjunction establishing the major connection that the new clause has back to what precedes. Now you see the bullet point on this slide has direct address as the second element. There's also the word interjection as the first element, and these two sentence functions are diagrammed the same way. So here's one that's an interjection. Behold. The word behold does not have a sentence function within the clause. It's not the subject of anything. It's not the main verb. It just stands alone as an intention-getting word. And so we'll diagram it just like we diagram the direct address, not as the introductory conjunction, but as that inserted element standing off to the side of the dotted line. All right, a couple of other considerations, and then for this video we'll be finished. Elliptical elements. Elliptical is not talking about a geometric shape here. It's talking about the fact that some things are left out of sentences sometimes. The Greek word from which the word elliptical derives is a word that means to leave out or to omit. And writers sometimes omit certain elements that are really necessary for full grammatical expression. When that happens, when you discover elliptical elements that are necessary for minimal grammatical expression, you put those into your diagram by one of the following means. Either you put a capital letter X, I guess you could use lowercase, in parentheses, and the parentheses indicates that this is an added element, not something that's actually expressed in the sentence. You either do that, or you go ahead and put the omitted Greek word in parentheses. If you know exactly what Greek word would be used, if it had been used, then go ahead and put that Greek word in parentheses. If you're not quite sure what the Greek word would be, but you can represent it in English, then just put an English translation of that omitted word in parentheses. But in each case, you use parentheses to show that this is an inserted element, not one actually expressed in the sentence. So back to Matthew 2:11. They presented gifts to him. Our English word they is necessary for grammatical expression. Every verb has to have a subject, but there's no separate Greek word for they. So as I diagram the sentence, I just let that capital X stand in the subject slot in parentheses to mark the ellipsis. If you prefer, you can use the English word they for some greater clarity about exactly what's missing. Sometimes the element that's left out is the verb. This is especially common with the linking verbs from me. So the first beatitude in Matthew 5 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," except there's no verb are in that sentence. You just have the predicate adjective blessed, then comes the subject, the poor in spirit. The verb is completely absent. In English, we've got to have that verb. So we'll supply it in parentheses. It would look awfully funny to draw a sentence diagram with nothing in the verb slot. So again, we can just put an X in parentheses if we like. Or here, I'll go ahead and use the Greek verb. It's not hard to know what form of me would be present if the verb were expressed. And so here I've given it to you in Greek. All right, one other consideration here before we finish. A detail on connecting modifiers. I've mentioned this, but let's go ahead and put some focus on it here. Don't connect the modifiers from the endpoints of the shelf on which the head word sits. And don't connect a modifier directly beneath baseline dividers. Let me show you what I mean. Here I'm using the word head as the word that's being modified, and the word modifier, of course, indicates the word doing the modifying. So you don't want to connect a modifier, as I have it here, on the left end of the head word slot. This is really bad right here under the subject-verb divider. Too many things are coming together at this one point. You've got the subject and the verb and this divider and the modifier all coming together. You really can't tell what that modifier modifies. Here at the end of the baseline, it looks almost as though this is a continuation of the baseline. For some reason, instead of continuing on straight, the baseline is dropping down and continuing on here. So the end point is not a good point to connect a modifier. So let's put a big red X over those things and not connect modifiers at any of those points. Instead, we want to always drop our modifiers from somewhere along the length of the horizontal line segment that contains the head word. So here would be good places. If you're really pressed for space on the right and you need to move your modifier way to the left, you can get it almost all the way to the end of the subject slot. Just be sure that you leave enough of a stub sticking out on the left to tell that that modifier is clearly under the subject and not just somehow hanging out on the end of the baseline for some reason. Here I've put one nice and centered under the verb. Here I've moved one not quite as close to the right end of the baseline as I was over here on the left end. But where you place those, you have a lot of flexibility about where you place those modifiers horizontally across those slots. Depending on what else is going on in that diagram, you may need space on the left side, so you have to move it to the right. You may need space on the right side, so you have to move it to the left. There's no virtue in attaching it dead center under the word it modifies. So move them to the right and left as necessary to give you the space that you need, but avoid those ambiguous or misleading points of connection that I've got under the red X. So we can put big smileys beside this bottom diagram to indicate that any of those locations for a modifier are just fine. We're finished with part 4. Happy diagramming.